So in this video, I'm going to talk about construct validity. Construct validity has to do with whether a measure is measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, whether it's valid, whether it means what you think it means. So let me start with a little bit of history. Early on in psychology, the way that researchers often went about trying to assess whether a measure was valid, producing valid scores, was to do something called criterion validity. Criterion validity means that you would look at the correlation between a measure and a criterion of where people actually stand on the thing you're trying to measure. So an example of an inventory that was developed in this way is the MMPI. It's still used some today. Stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Psychological Inventory. And the way the MMPI worked was that researchers developed a whole bunch of questions. There was like hundreds and hundreds of questions on this questionnaire about things that the researchers just thought in general would tell you something about people's psychological well-being, their mental illness, etc. And then they would give the MMPI to groups of people who differed in some clinical diagnosis. So for example, if you want to create a depression scale, you'd get a sample of people who are depressed, you'd get a sample of people who are not depressed, you'd give them the MMPI, and then you would look at what items are endorsed more by the depressed people than the other group, or vice versa. And that would be a way to develop a scale. And likewise, the way you would test whether the scale is valid is you'd see, does this do a good job of differentiating between depressed and non-depressed people? Now, this was a useful approach, but part of the problem is that there's no gold standard. There's no way to know whether people are actually depressed or not. That itself has to come from a measurement. So if you have the MMPI and you're trying to see, is it valid? Well, let me get a new sample of depressed and not depressed people, see whether it can predict the difference. How do you know who's depressed or not depressed? Well, it might be from a clinical diagnosis when they got into their therapist's office and their therapist decided whether depressed or not depressed. But that itself is a measurement procedure. That's something you have a therapist interview them and make a diagnosis. How do you know that's valid? Well, we know that's valid because it corresponds with what experts say. Well, how do you know they're valid, et cetera, et cetera. It's turtles all the way down. It's just everything's resting on some other measurement. There's no ground truth. There's no reality that we have direct access to. We're always measuring things. And so researchers recognized that this was a problem. And in the 1950s and 1960s, psychology researchers developed a new approach that became known as construct validity. Two important figures were Paul Meehl and Jane Levenger. They wrote some early papers outlining how to do this. And so this is where this idea that when we validate something, we have a theory and then we test propositions of the theory. This is where that comes from, is this idea of construct validity. So nowadays, if we have a measure and someone says this is a good measure of depression, and we want to know, well, is it a good measure of depression? We would have a theory that says, what are the properties of a good measure of depression? What should it correlate with? What should it look like, etc.? And then we would see whether it meets those predicted properties from our theory of depression, rather than just does it predict who's depressed and who's not. That might be part of the story if we have an already good existing measure, but it's not the whole thing. So when we're talking about construct validity, we're talking about lots of different kinds of evidence, lots of different converging kinds of evidence to give us an overall view of what's the construct validity. So I want to talk about a few different components or aspects or angles or ways of thinking about validity that are part of this bigger picture. One of them is what's called face validity. Face validity means a subjective judgment of the plausibility of whether something is valid. So this would be kind of our first maybe gut response, maybe it's an expert-informed response, but you look at a measure and you say, does it make sense that this is probably measuring what they say it's measuring? This applies to a lot of things. It's kind of a first approximation. It's not the most sophisticated thing in the world, but even with face validity, there are times when it's not going to apply, when we wouldn't expect it to apply. So an example, here's an item from a questionnaire that's used in psychology a lot. The item is, if I ruled the world, it would be a better place. And so you might ask people, do you tend to agree or disagree with this statement? Well, it turns out this is not a measure of potential to be king. Which is what a face validity test might tell you it is. What this is a measure of, or it comes from a measure of narcissism. So, some people will endorse items like this, just normal, well-functioning people. But if you have lots and lots of these kinds of grandiose items and somebody consistently endorses all of them, it's probably an indication of their narcissism rather than their leadership potential. Here's another example from a questionnaire. You ask people, rate your familiarity with the following concepts: centripetal force, hydroponics, colorine. So you would give somebody a questionnaire with a whole bunch of questions like this, and they would mark how many that they're familiar with. And so from a face validity perspective, you might say, oh, this is a test of scientific knowledge. That's what it looks like. But in fact, this is a test of what's called overclaiming, because some of the items on the list are made-up words. In this case, colorine is a made-up word. Sounds like maybe a chemical or something like that. Doesn't exist. So if people tend to endorse those made-up words, this is used as a measure of overclaiming, of whether people claim to have knowledge that they don't actually have, if they tend to endorse their familiarity with things that are made up. A second kind of validity, a second way we think about this big picture of construct validity, one part of that is something called content validity. When we're assessing content validity, we're assessing whether a measure captures all parts of a defined construct. So an example of this, let's say we're developing a measure of school achievement. We want to know how well did people do in school. If we ask people, what was your grade in your math class, that wouldn't have very good content validity because people are typically taking lots and lots of different kinds of classes. We're only assessing one aspect of it. So if we're assessing the content validity of a school achievement measure, we'd want to look at, does it cover all the different parts of school achievement that are part of our construct definition of what school achievement means? Another example, we might be developing a measure of negative emotionality. And if we're doing, let's say, a self-report questionnaire, we're asking people, how often do you feel sad? How often do you feel afraid? We'd ask, well, is sad and afraid all there is to negative emotions? What about anger? What about jealousy? And so forth and so on. And so we would ask, we have a theory of emotions that tells us these are the different kinds of emotions that people could experience. These are the negative ones. And then based on that theory, we would ask whether this includes a broad range of the emotions as defined by the theory. If it does, then it has good content validity. A third kind of validity we might assess when we're thinking about construct validity is criterion validity. Now, you recall earlier I said this used to be all that people assessed, criterion validity. We didn't throw it away when we adopted construct validity. We understand it's not perfect, that there is no gold standard, but it's still a useful part of assessing the overall validity of something. So with criterion validity, we're asking, is a measure associated with some kind of a concrete behavioral outcome as would be predicted by theory? So an example of that, if we're developing a new IQ test, we might have a theory that says people with higher IQ are supposed to have better grades in school. And so we would say, does this IQ test predict people's grades in school? Or if we're developing a new depression screening questionnaire, let's say you want to give people a short questionnaire when they're seeing their primary care physician to understand whether they should be referred to a psychotherapist, we would assess its criterion validity by seeing, does this screening tool assess an actual diagnosis by a trained psychotherapist? So these are examples of criterion validity where we're saying there's some concrete outcome that's supposed to be associated with it. Does the measure actually predict that concrete outcome? The last pair of validities I want to talk about, a really important part of construct validity, is convergent and discriminant validity. These are two things that kind of go next to each other. They're kind of yin and yang, or, two sides of a coin. So with convergent validity, what we're measuring are measures that are supposed to be of the same construct highly correlated with each other. That's convergent validity. So let's say I have several depression questionnaires and I want to know, do they have good convergent validity? I would give them to a sample of people and I'd say, do the people that score high on one depression questionnaire also score high on the other depression questionnaire? If so, I'm seeing evidence of convergent validity. And if I'm developing a new one, I might say, does this new depression questionnaire correlate with well-established existing questionnaires to see whether it has good convergent validity? The sort of flip side of the coin is something called discriminant validity. And this one sometimes takes a little while to wrap your head around, but this is a really important one. With discriminant validity, we're asking whether measures of different constructs have a low correlation. And that's evidence of good discriminant validity if that's the case. So let's say, for example, I'm developing my new depression screening questionnaire and I give it to a sample of people. I would consult my theory and I would say, what are some things that this shouldn't be correlated with if it's picking up on depression, but it might be correlated with if I've done a poor job of developing my questionnaire. So for example, I might give people the depression questionnaire, and alongside of it, I might give them a questionnaire about some other psychological disorder that's not very highly overlapping with depression. And so if they score high on both, maybe instead of making a depression questionnaire, I just made a general distress questionnaire. But if it can distinguish between people who have depression and, let's say, people who have symptoms of schizophrenia or people who have autistic spectrum disorders or other things, then I would say, okay, it has good discriminant validity because it can tell apart the difference between depression and other kinds of psychological distress or just differences in functioning that are not part of depression and not supposed to be the same thing. So one reason we often see poor discriminant validity, that is to say, one reason that two things that are supposed to be measuring different things, but they end up correlating with each other anyway, one reason we sometimes see that is something called common method bias. Common method bias tends to occur when we have measures of different constructs, but they're correlated because they use the same method or similar methods. And so that contributes to poor discriminant validity. So for example, if I'm giving people, let's say, my depression questionnaire, and then I give them a questionnaire about how well they do in school or something like that, and let's say that there are some people in my sample who just want to try to look good on everything. So they say, no, I'm not depressed, and yes, I'm doing well in school. This would be a common method bias. I've done both approaches by self-report, and so this common bias of people just trying to appear good on questionnaires would affect both measures, and it would cause them to have poor discriminant validity. These measures would be more strongly correlated than they're supposed to be according to theory. Okay, so to put it all together, when we're judging the weight of evidence for a measure's construct validity, there are lots of different things we want to look at. If you've got a new measure, whether it's a self-report, whether it's a physiological measure, whether it's an observational measure, you want to ask a number of questions about it. One is, how reliable is it? How consistent are the scores under conditions where they're supposed to be consistent? So test-retest over intervals where the construct isn't supposed to change, agreement between different items if you're using a multi-item questionnaire, agreement between different raters if you're using an observational measure. Does it look plausible and reflect the construct like it should? So if it looks plausible, that would be face validity. If it reflects the construct like it should and all parts of the construct, that would be content validity. We should ask ourselves, is there evidence that predicts important outcomes that it's supposed to predict according to theory? That would be criterion validity. Ask yourself, is there evidence it correlates with other measures of the same construct? Is this new depression questionnaire correlated with other measures of depression? That's convergent validity. And is there evidence that it does not correlate with measures of different constructs, that even if they use the same method? That would be evidence of discriminant validity, showing that it can tell the difference between what it's supposed to be measuring and other things. Okay, that wraps up this video. Don't forget the concept check questions, and I'll see you next time.